Let me introduce myself to you all. I'm going to go by my nickname JT in order to keep the story flowing properly. I just want to make sure nobody loses track of the shuffle, so to speak. This is a tale from back in my younger years, 2010 to be exact. My sister Lara had just turned 21. She was still living at home with my mom and stepdad while attending nursing classes at our community college. The night of her 21st birthday was spent in a relatively quiet way with family. Just a good steak dinner and a birthday cake that my mom made from scratch. Then we all split a bottle of wine and talked about our week. It was a quiet, peaceful family get-together, really no different than any other since my sister and I reached adulthood. At some time during the night, my sister asked if she could throw her own birthday party and just invite a few friends. We were no longer teenagers at this point, and when we invited friends over, it was normally just to hang out, order some pizza, and play Settlers of Catan, or whatever board game we got our hands on. I know, wild and crazy, right? She and I were a bit different as kids. She developed an aggressive form of ovarian cancer when she was 13. Through years of chemotherapy combined with a hysterectomy, she managed to beat it. Those were some absolutely chaotic years, so our parents completely understood why our idea of a good time was a quiet one. My mom thought for a second about Lara's request and told her that she would have to figure out how she and our stepdad could have a date night. Her only request was to give them at least a week in order to do so. A week rolled by, and my sister gave me a phone call at work. I called her on my lunch break, and she let me know that the plan was a go, and I could bring a friend or two with me if I wanted. There was this girl by the name of Dana, who worked across the street at our local library. She and I were in the process of getting to know one another through small talk, but she seemed really cool. I figured now would be the time to shoot my shot. I told my sister what I was going to do, and from the other side of the line, I heard this gleeful giggle and a supportive, "Go for it." Long story short, I had a little bit of time left on my break, and a couple of books to return anyway, so it all kind of worked out. She said she had the weekend off and nothing going on, so she was more than happy to come. Fast forward to that Saturday afternoon. I met Dana at the library, and she went to the grocery store with me to grab a few things before going to the party. Nothing major league, just a couple of those cube-shaped boxes of Mountain Dew and Pepsi, some chips, backup refreshments, just in case. As we were walking around the grocery store, Dana started making some small talk with me, and she mentioned that she may have accidentally let slip that she was going to a house party this weekend with a couple of friends. I told her it was no big deal. It wasn't exactly like her friends knew where my parents lived. She looked down at her feet sheepishly and said, "I told a couple of my girlfriends and one of them knows your sister. I told them it was just going to be a quiet get-together and not some big party, just a few people and some board games. I really hope they don't show up. They're my friends and all, but they're the worst kind of moochers." Still, I didn't see it as a reason to panic, at least not at first. When I asked what the worst was that they could do, Dana pretty much told me that they were the types to raid a liquor cabinet and down the entirety of the most expensive alcohol they could find. I responded by saying, "Joke's on them if they come to the party, only to realize that nobody in my household drinks. It's to the point where we fight about whether it's even necessary to have a liquor cabinet. I hope they like semi-expired boxed wine." She laughed at my response. I guess she figured she was panicking over nothing, and we left it at that. About an hour later, we arrived at my parents' place, and as we went in, my sister took Dana to the side for a little girl talk. I set the groceries down on the counter and began helping set up for the party while they chatted. My mom and stepdad decided that they were going to take a drive 3 counties over to a bowling alley in the area and make a night of it before hitting up a restaurant for dinner. We knew they were over an hour away, and if they came home during the party, depending on what game we broke out, there may be more room at the table. I grabbed the stack of board games from a shelf in the hallway closet and stacked them neatly in the middle of the table. I asked my sister what she wanted for her pizza, and I ordered a few for delivery. From that point, we just sat and waited for the guests to arrive. The first person to show up was our cousin and his boyfriend at the time, followed up by a couple of my sister's closest friends from the community college. She told me we were expecting one more person, and they should be there shortly. From that point, it was just a matter of getting some food in our bellies and setting up whatever game we chose. It was supposed to be a simple night. The last person then showed up, the daughter of our old next-door neighbor, a friendship my sister and I had maintained since childhood. Now that everyone was there, we decided we were going to break out Risk. As we were going through the process of setting up, we heard another knock at the door. My cousin got up to answer, and we heard a female voice say, We're here with Dana. They were two girls who looked as if they walked right out of an Abercrombie & Fitch ad. They were pretty, tall, and slender, with platinum blonde hair, dressed in golf skirts and polo shirts. They were totally giving off the whole spoiled rich girl vibe, and they were standing in the doorway. Dana got up and saw the two girls standing there, and she just invited them in. She introduced them as Chelsea and Nadine, and then she told us that they were the two friends that she told about the party. They introduced themselves to us, and I got this total sense of false sincerity. They had this attitude of having absolutely nothing better to do than slumming it with the locals. She saw Risk partially set up on the table and made a comment about how they were absolutely not going to play board games. Me being me, I shut them down immediately. I told them that I understand Dana invited them, but we had no idea they were coming until the last second. The plan was a quiet evening with pizza and board games, and if they weren't cool with the idea, then they didn't have to stay. Their attitudes took an immediate shift for the better, and they surprisingly apologized for the way they came off. They just let us know that board games really weren't their thing, and they were counting on it being a night that they weren't sure they would enjoy. I told them to give it a shot. I told them that our friend group was actually pretty fun, and we were more than inviting, as long as the mood stayed chill. They looked at each other and agreed in unison that they'd give it a shot. I was in the living room grabbing a couple of spare chairs to put around the gaming table when there was another knock at the door. I walked over and opened the door to be greeted by three guys. "Hey, we're here for the party," they said. I looked them up and down, and when I got ready to say that we didn't have room for anybody else, they pushed past me and made their way into the kitchen, the acrid smell of marijuana smoke trailing behind them. To make matters better, I got this sudden urge to look at our driveway. Two more cars pulled up, each of them full of people. I looked on in frustration as people poured through the front door like a bunch of extras in an American Pie knockoff film. At one point, I got shoved to the side and knocked off my feet. I was getting livid. Finally, two more guys showed up, and I got to look at them. I didn't know who they were, but I did know that I was getting ready to read them the riot act. They both dressed like a couple of country boys. Carhartt boots, blue jeans, and one of them was wearing a Johnny Cash t-shirt, and he reached down to help me up. He introduced himself as Dalton, and the friend that came with him was his younger brother, Vince. They mentioned Lara had called them earlier on in the week to let them know about the quiet birthday party. They commented on the absolute chaos that was going on. Their story was backed up a little bit more when I finally got a good look at Vince, and I saw that he was holding a vintage Stratego box. They asked if they could come in, a first among the crowd that just invited themselves in like it was their house. I truly appreciated the manners and told them to head on inside. Vince didn't say a lot, and it took me a minute to realize why. Then Dalton turned around and started communicating to him in ASL, American Sign Language. Vince playfully slapped his forehead with his free hand and gave a little laugh. He pointed at the board game and pointed at the living room table. I just nodded yes. He put it down and went back out to the Jeep they drove over and came back with 4 or 5 Little Caesars pizzas. I know they're not necessarily the best, but how can you pass up all that pizza for $25? Dalton said with a chuckle. I raised an eyebrow and gave a half grin. You make a great point, I responded. I helped them bring the pizzas in, and in all honesty, I didn't notice the door hadn't shut all the way behind me. I looked in the kitchen, and amidst all the chaos, I saw my sister putting away the Risk game. She had a look on her face like she wanted to scream. She saw Dalton and his brother, and made a beeline to them before grabbing Dalton by his arm and asking him to follow her to the next room. I looked over at the two of them, and I saw her give him the kind of hug you give somebody when you're relieved to see them. They talked for a minute, and I could tell that she was stressed out about the whole situation. She then walked over to me with Dalton and let me know that she wanted to wait until tonight, when we had friends around, to let everybody know that she and Dalton had decided to date. That prompted me to go into level 3 protective brother mode. What I mean is that protective brother mode has 10 levels. Level 7 through 10, you never want to see. Anything up until that point ranges from friendly banter, getting to know whether or not that person is a decent person or not, or verbally putting them in their place if the mood ever calls for it. So I made it a point to get to know this guy. We chatted for over 2 hours, and surprisingly the chaos wasn't too bad. He joined in with making sure the place stayed as clean as possible. We were walking around collecting paper plates, soda cans, and beer cans that other guests brought along. While we went, I was asking him some questions, and he was batting 1,000. Turns out he was a really good guy. His family grows soybeans on the outskirts of town, and his grandparents were dairy farmers, a little bit further up the road. I learned that he was going to the community college and taking an agriculture course, so he could not only continue the family tradition, but do it as correctly as possible. He also told me that he completely understood where I was coming from, because when Vince was 3, he contracted an illness that caused him to be hospitalized for close to a year. This illness cost him his hearing, and Vince had spent years protecting his brother as well. What I didn't know that night was that I was actually speaking to my future brother-in-law. Dalton and Vince are both stand-up guys. It was like we struck up an instant friendship due to our mutual understanding of having a protective nature. But as we were chatting, I started to feel a draft. I looked over, and I saw the front door swinging wide open. I popped into the kitchen and got a head count. I think I saw everybody that had been there, but it was honestly hard to tell due to all the random individuals that showed up. I shut the door, thinking nothing of it, and I went back to chatting with Dalton. He pulled out a pack of Black & Milds and asked if he could smoke on the front porch. I said sure, and asked if he wouldn't mind if I joined him. The thing is, I'm not a smoker, but we were in the middle of a really good conversation, and I wanted to continue. And with that, we went outside. We were not really far into our conversation. As a matter of fact, I think he only got 3 good puffs off of his little wood-tipped cigar before my cousin's boyfriend came bolting out the door screaming. He was saying that we had to get in there because a fight had broken out. I asked who, and he said it was between my cousin and one of the random individuals who just showed up. When he said just showed up, I didn't realize he meant within the past couple of minutes. I got inside, and I found that the laundry room door attached to the kitchen had been broken. The person fighting with my cousin was on top of him with his hands around his throat. He was choking him, and this caused me to spring into action. But before I could make it over there, my sister got between me and the assailant. She managed to pull him off. Just then, the assailant turned around and backhanded my sister in the mouth. That was when I realized who it was. It was her ex-boyfriend, Myron. The two of them had an ugly breakup, and for a while he had been stalking her. It actually got to the point where he'd been served a restraining order, and a couple years had gone by. We honestly thought he'd moved on, but no. There he was, standing over my sister, screaming out a litany of profanities. Suddenly, I felt protective brother mode shift to a 10. Now, before I get into this, I want everybody to understand that I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'6" in combat boots, and 135 pounds after a shower. But I took off like a star linebacker, and I tackled him to the ground. The rest is a blur, because I blacked out, but from what I was told, I beat him so badly that I broke his orbital socket, broke his nose, and fractured his jaw. It took my cousin's boyfriend, Dalton, Vince, and 2 other people to pull me off of him. I knocked Myron out cold, and he laid on the ground snoring. Somebody at the party called 911, and as my parents pulled up to see the chaos, I was being put in the back of a squad car. The next few months absolutely sucked. I got charged with assault, and the cop who arrested me didn't want to hear my story. He actually went as far as to call me a psycho, despite the fact I did what any family member would have done when they felt a loved one was in danger. I didn't watch my sister beat cancer to get beat on by an ex that shouldn't have even been there to begin with. Thankfully, Dalton's family was informed of the situation, and they put me in contact with a good lawyer that got the charges dropped in the subsequent trial. The judge completely understood where I came from. He even made a remark to Myron that he was lucky people were there to pull me off of him, because it could have been far worse. And had he been in the same position, he couldn't guarantee he wouldn't have done the same thing. When the judge asked Myron why he was even there to begin with, he said with all of the cocky stupidity he could muster up,
"Because I wanted to have a good time. My sister told me about the party, and I figured I would go."
And as it turned out, Nadine was Myron's stepsister. And here comes the plot twist. We hadn't even left the courtroom when the judge ordered Myron to be arrested. The restraining order was still seen as being valid. On top of that, one of the other officers on the scene that night took pictures of my sister's injuries. Even though it was nothing more than a bloody lip and a bruise on the face, it was enough to get him charged with assault. After I left the courthouse, I made my way over to the library. I wanted to see if Dana had been working. She'd gone radio silent with me since that night. When I got to the library, I didn't see her at first. I figured maybe it was her day off, but then I heard an all too familiar voice say in an uncomfortable tone, "Hey, you." I turned around to see her pushing a cart full of books to return. I guess she saw me before I saw her and made her way over to me. I took a deep breath before I spoke. So the guy that came into our house that night, you know, the one that I beat up for choking my cousin and slapping my sister, turns out he's Nadine's stepbrother. He's also my sister's abusive ex. Dana got this look on her face like she was fighting back the urge to cry. She pushed the book cart over to a corner table far away from the entrance, and she motioned for me to come over. She asked me to sit. Look, I'm sorry I didn't talk to you after everything went down. If I'm being honest, seeing that side of you scared me. But I had no idea Nadine had anything to do with that creep. I do know she's the one who called the police and the medics, but she was also the one who said she knew your sister, and that she'd be okay with her coming to the party. I'm so sorry I even opened up my mouth to begin with. I misread the situation. I thought it was going to be a big thing before you told me otherwise. I honestly thought it was going to stop at Chelsea and Nadine. Well, you were wrong, I responded. Lucky for me, Dalton's family managed to help me hire a lawyer that got the charges dropped. The judge saw the whole incident as me defending my family. That being said, Myron got arrested before leaving the courtroom. The judge got him for violating the restraining order we had against him. He was also charged with assault. Dana's lower lip began to tremble. I saw tears forming in her eyes. I'm so sorry. Look, don't apologize. I'm not too thrilled with the fact that the two friends that invited themselves just so happened to be the types of people that would invite half the neighborhood to a party meant for 8 people at most. You said they were mooches. You didn't say they were leeches. I could have done time. You get that right? I almost lost my job over this. I took one hell of a cut in hours. I could have lost my freedom. And for what? Beating the crap out of somebody that assaulted my family members first. It was pretty obvious to me at that point that she felt bad, but because of everything that had happened, I didn't see her in the same light anymore. She abandoned me for doing the right thing. Don't get me wrong, I understand. If I had technically been on a first date with somebody, and out of the blue they beat the crap out of someone, I'd be scared too. But at least I'd want to know why. She didn't even bother to ask that before disappearing like a puff of smoke in the wind. I'm not gonna lie, I was angry about this for a while. It honestly took years for me to get past the whole ordeal. I got into counseling because the blackout scared the hell out of me. Up until that point, nothing like that had ever happened to me before. But as time went on, life did what it does. My sister ended up moving further upstate to finish nursing school. That way, she was able to get the required time working at an actual hospital. Dalton and Vince still stuck around town because Dalton's overall plan was to take over the family soybean farm, and he would eventually do so. Myron was found guilty on all counts, and he ended up doing time. Apparently sometime during his prison stint, word got out that he was in there for attacking his ex-girlfriend. Turns out, that's frowned upon in most prisons. When he was finally released, he permanently required the use of crutches. Occasionally, I still see him around town, and he does everything in his power to avoid eye contact with me. He hasn't made an attempt to contact my sister, let alone anyone else in my family, since that day in court. And honestly, I hope it stays that way. But just in case, Myron, you should know that the family has gotten quite a bit bigger. Laura and Dalton got married in 2015, and if you think one super protective brother is bad, why don't you try your luck with her equally protective husband and 5 brother-in-laws, as well as me. For your health, I certainly hope you're not dumb enough to try. Back in the spring of 2012, I had been dating this guy named Dylan for a little over a month. I was 23 and just out of college while he was in graduate school. He was still living with his friends in an apartment close to the school, while I had my own place downtown. I was just working at an office supplies store part-time, and my parents were still helping me out with expenses. Still, it was the first time in my life that I kind of felt like a grown-up. Most of my free time was spent looking for work in my field, but interviews were rare, and it wasn't looking promising. Even though I wasn't making money, it wasn't all bad, because my apartment was just a 15-minute walk away from work, and some of my friends were close by as well. I was able to go most days without setting foot in a bus or streetcar. Dylan and I had met in college because we were in the same circle of friends. However, after most of us graduated, our group really split up since most people moved away. These guys that Dylan lived with were different from that group of ours. When we first met, they were just his gaming friends. They would meet up online and play first-person shooter-type games like Halo and Counter-Strike. I always hated it when he would play those games because it was boring to watch, and it was almost impossible to pull him away from it. One time I went over to his place that he shared with 3 other guys. As soon as I walked in, I noticed that all the lights were out and 2 of them were in the living room playing games. I tried talking to Dylan, but his roommates got mad at me for making any sound. Eventually, Dylan convinced them to turn it off, and we were able to hang out for a while. That was the first time I ever really talked to his roommate, Tim. Right from the start, I could tell that Tim didn't like me very much. I was trying to be friendly, but it was obvious that he wasn't interested. In my opinion, he was annoyed that I was taking Dylan away from the other group, but maybe I gave off a vibe to him as well. I don't know for sure. In any case, it was an awkward evening, and eventually, I convinced Dylan to come to my place so we could have more space. After that night, every time I went over to Dylan's place, I got a bad feeling from his roommates. Every time I was there, all 3 of them were always home at the same time. It was like they never went out anywhere. They didn't seem to like me, and it got to the point where I was not comfortable being there. I told that to Dylan, and he didn't take it well. He said that I was putting no effort into getting along with his friends, and that I was a bad girlfriend. That stung deep, because I thought I had tried really hard. We didn't break up right then, but the end was not far away. We broke up about a month later, triggered by a fight over nothing, but it was really deeper than that. It was a tough time for me because I felt like those roommates of his came between us and caused a good relationship to end. Not more than a week later, I was at work, and Dylan's roommate Tim walked in. I saw him from across the store, but it didn't look like he saw me. I didn't want to talk to him, but I also didn't bother hiding or anything. The store was not that close to their place, so I didn't know why he would come there specifically. I kept my head down, pretending to do some paperwork behind the counter, but then I looked up and locked eyes with Tim from across the room. I looked down right away, and the next time I looked up, he was gone. I know that he didn't buy anything because I was right next to the only checkout. He just came in, walked around, and then left. I knew that he knew where I worked because Dylan would have told him for sure. One night, about a month after the breakup, I was out for the night with some friends. We were at a dive bar downtown that was close to my friend Janine's apartment. We had some wine there first, then headed out and spent the next few hours talking over some more drinks. At about midnight, I wanted to go home, but the rest of them wanted to stay. I went out alone on the dark street. It would be about a 20-minute walk for me to get home. Even though I would normally call an Uber, I decided to walk so I could sober up before going to bed. When I was just a block from my apartment, a car passed me slowly. I recognized it as belonging to one of Dylan's roommates. It was a blue Toyota hatchback, and I think the license plate looked familiar. I tried to see who was driving, but the windows were slightly tinted, and I couldn't see inside. I hurried the rest of the way home and went inside. Once I was safely in my apartment, I convinced myself that it was my imagination. Then I went to bed. Throughout all of this time, there was no contact with Dylan at all. As far as I was concerned, it was a clean break, and neither of us contacted the other. Still, I had the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was seeing Tim at work, or the car, but I thought something was going on. At the time, I didn't know how right I was. I was working till close on a Friday. The store was only open until 8 p.m., so it was not that bad. I had plans to go to my friend's place afterwards, and some of my other friends were coming over as well. Since it was a nice night, I decided to walk, and I was there before 8:30. We sat around and had some drinks for a while. Then one of the girls suggested that we go out. Everybody was up for it except me, but I didn't say anything, because I didn't want to be a party pooper. As soon as we left the apartment, though, I decided to walk home instead of going out. I said my goodbyes and then headed down the street alone. It was quiet for a Friday, but there were still some cars passing. Not that many, though. When I was about halfway home, a car pulled up next to me. It was that blue Toyota hatchback. I kept my eyes pointed ahead and walked faster. It seemed that the car wasn't following me because it seemed to have stopped. I was too scared to look back and make sure, though. Before I knew it, I was grabbed from behind, and I was being dragged backwards down the street. There were 2 men carrying me, so struggling was useless. I did scream, though, but nobody seemed to care. They put me in the back of the car, and there were 2 masked men in the front seats. I could barely see their eyes in the rearview mirror. There was also a masked guy in the back seat with me. I was screaming as loud as I could, but in the confines of that car, I knew it was probably useless. The 3 men didn't say a word to me, which added to the creepiness, but the one next to me took the phone from my pocket. As soon as I managed to calm down, I knew that it was Dylan's roommates. I knew the car, and I also recognized the smell coming off of them. It was a pungent mix of BO with a faint touch of pot smoke. I started trying to talk to them, thinking that they would let me go if I promised not to tell. That did nothing though, and none of them budged. Not knowing what else to do, I just laid there crying for what felt like forever. Eventually, I looked out the window, and it seemed that we were out in the country somewhere. All I could see were trees on either side, and there were no longer any streetlights to be seen. Suddenly, the car came to a stop, and the two in the front got out. All this time, none of them had said a word to me. The door next to my side opened, and one of them dragged me out. I was not tied up or anything, but I tried to comply anyway. As soon as I was on my feet, only one of them was holding me by the arm gently. I thought it would be easy to get away, but I knew I would only have one chance at an escape like that. All around me were nothing but trees. I could see the faint outline of the road we came in on, but other than that, it was nothing. I bided my time for a minute or so, but then I looked at one of them and saw that he had a gun. A sudden surge of adrenaline hit me, and I yanked my arm away, then started running into the woods. As I went, I could hear one of the guys yelling. That was the first time I heard any of their voices, and I was pretty sure it was Tim. And I heard someone screaming over and over again.
You effing idiot, you effing idiot.
What really shocked me about that was that it was Dylan's voice. He was one of the three. Up until then, I thought it was just his psycho roommates that were after me, but he was in on it too. I was running through the woods for a long time, but I could see the main road through the trees. I was too scared to go out to it though, because I didn't want them to catch me. Eventually, I saw a truck passing, and I popped out to wave it down. The driver was a nice older guy, and he agreed to call the cops for me. The police were on the scene within minutes, and the three of them were arrested that night. I was taken to the police station for a more thorough interview. As they told me, Dylan and his friends claimed that the whole thing was just a joke, and they maintained that I was in on it. That was a complete lie, because I had no idea. One thing to note, though, is that the gun was fake, so that kind of goes with their story. So maybe they weren't really going to kill me, but it was still kidnapping, and completely criminal. They were probably stalking me too. All three of them did prison time for what they did to me, but I still think they got off easily. It is hard to imagine what they were thinking when planning such a crazy stunt. I never would have guessed that they were that dangerous, but looking back, the warning signs were there. I just chose to ignore them. This happened almost 20 years ago when I was 18. I joined a skateboarding forum online. For those that don't remember the early internet, those things were big back then. It was just a message board, not unlike Reddit or something. That's where I met a girl named Lisa. We started chatting regularly, first about skateboarding, and then about more personal things. Over months, we became close. She lived in Germany, and I was in the United States, so it felt like a distant friendship, but it was meaningful to me. I didn't know it at first, but eventually, I found out that she was 32 years old, and like I said, I was 18. That only came up when we began sharing pictures. That didn't put me off at all, but I was young and dumb back then. I didn't tell my parents because I knew how they would react. After over a year of talking online, we decided it was time to meet in person. I was a student at the time, but over the summer vacation, I finally booked a flight to Germany. Meeting her for the first time was surreal. We had developed such a close relationship online, but it finally became real. We clicked instantly, just like we had online, and the connection was undeniable. It didn't take long for us to fall in love. Lisa was a government worker in Berlin, and she had a nice apartment in the city with an extra bedroom. On the second or third day of my visit, she was already hinting that I should move over there to be with her. I really wanted to do it, but knew that my parents would be against it. At the time, I wanted to finish my degree, then see where things went. My trip was only for 2 weeks, so before I knew it, I was back home in New Jersey. We kept talking after that, and things only got more serious. Then I started telling my parents that I wanted to transfer there. They were very adamant that I finish my education before doing anything like that, but Lisa was putting a lot of pressure on me, and I was afraid of losing her. When the next summer came, I had decided to move to Germany to be with her. I managed to transfer to a university there, so I didn't have to drop out. That was probably the only reason that my parents didn't disown me over it. When I got there, and we moved in together, everything was great for about a week. I was going to school and getting used to the new lifestyle. It was actually the first time I had ever lived away from my parents. But soon later, things changed. Lisa became very controlling and jealous. It was almost like having a really strict mother. I didn't have my own money, and she used that to manipulate me. The language barrier also made things harder. Even though most people spoke English well, making friends was difficult, and I started to feel isolated. Living with Lisa was challenging. She was always keeping tabs on me, questioning my every move. My lack of money made me dependent on her, and she didn't hesitate to remind me of that. There were even days where I would get little or no food, simply because she was mad at me. Things were bad, but I didn't even want to admit it to myself. I was 20 years old with a 34-year-old, and she was a lot more capable in the world than I was. I felt trapped in an unfamiliar country, unable to speak the language fluently, and struggling to fit in. Trying to leave Lisa was difficult. Whenever I made an attempt, she would get violent, yelling, and sometimes even throwing things. I was scared and unsure of what to do. Each time I considered leaving, I realized I had nowhere else to go. My social circle was non-existent, and I felt completely isolated. I took her back multiple times because I didn't see any other options. After a particularly bad fight, I decided I had to do something. I called my parents and finally told them how bad things had gotten. They were shocked and immediately bought me a plane ticket back to the United States. I packed my things quickly, leaving behind everything that couldn't fit in a single suitcase. The sense of relief I felt when I boarded the plane was immense. Returning to the US was overwhelming. I had to restart my life from scratch, which included re-enrolling in school and facing the consequences of my time abroad. I had failed that semester, and catching up on my studies meant retaking several classes. It was a difficult adjustment, trying to regain my footing academically while dealing with the emotional toll of the past year. But it wasn't the last time I heard from her. She was constantly sending me messages, claiming that I owed her thousands for rent while we lived together. There was never any arrangement like that, and she knew I didn't have money, so I never paid her. The messages kept coming though, and they became even more threatening. I tried to block her on everything, but she kept finding me. As Facebook and other social media platforms popped up, Lisa found me and kept harassing me. It has been almost 20 years now, and every once in a while, I get a new message from her. If there wasn't an ocean separating us, then I would be really scared, because she is seriously crazy. The last message I got from her was an Instagram DM, and she said she was going to kill me. That was just over 2 weeks ago.